Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you first for all of you for coming, especially for Aaron for organising it, and I must say I really enjoyed hearing the speakers this morning and this afternoon. It's been a little tale of calamities actually getting here. I lost my computer that my original presentation was on about 3 or 4 days ago. Then coming through customs, I'd found I'd lost my declaration between Ireland and the US, so I was wandering around US customs under the guidance of one of your security officials for a while, wondering would I ever get here. And then I found that the re-presentation I'd been working on had partially collapsed. So this is, it gets truncated later on, but we're going to ad lib. So I want to begin with a story. Yeah. I spent quite a bit of time in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. And here are some people, they're doing a shardak with wool from mountain goats. And one of the things about these people is, firstly, they're pretty self-sufficient. They would be what are classically regarded as the people living on between $1 and $2 a day. And one of their great sources of cash income are their apple trees. And in the village next door to here, there were 49 varieties of apple in one village. It's the origin of where apples come. And all of that is there. And here's a woman sorting apples, and that's something I did because I had a friend who was doing her PhD down the road in Ann Arbor, who is an ethnobiologist studying these things. And one of the problems, unofficial problems of these apples, is that some are rather bitter, and some are gnarly, and some are prone to pests. And this, to the people, they're well able to deal with it. Some are sold for cash, makes up about 30 to 40, 50% of their income, depending, of over a year. And some they eat and dry, and some are effectively fed to the animals. They're pretty useless and that. So that is how their economy works. And they grow some other things in these gardens, but really the apples are their big cash crop. Now, what happens if you are a poor country and rich countries become interested in you is that they come to tell you how to do things properly, to show you the way. And it so happened at this time that the place, probably it still is, infested with NGOs from across the developed world, coming to save people from terrorism, from themselves, from poverty, etc. And they're on the lookout, because that's how they keep going, for opportunities. And here was the opportunity. The opportunity was, this is incredibly inefficient. All of these apples going to waste. So they came up with a plan, looking at their general agriculture, and they said, we'll give you great trees. Big, juicy apple trees that you'll be able to make juice from, added value, and we all know that's great. We'll give you fertilizer and pesticides. You're partially you're going to need it for the trees, but partially, we'll help you grow other things at a greater level of productivity. And finally, we're going to fund it through loans and microfinance. And this was when it originally clicked for me, because I knew about climate change, I'd started reading about peak oil, I knew a little bit about economics, and it was, this is how you become trapped. You go into this situation, let's say it didn't happen because my friend and others said you can't do this to this biodiversity, but look what the situation would have been if they had gone ahead with it. Firstly, being the poorest, they would have made more money, of course. They're growing now super apples. They're getting a bigger cash income. And they're sending their children maybe off to Bishkek, to the capital, to study in the university, where they'll hopefully, they won't get a job, quite frankly. And they now have more income, debt, reduced biodiversity, and a dependency on fertilizers. And you think, okay, what happens if the oil price rises? These are the last people who can afford. These are the people on the margins. What happens if there's major climate events? What was before was the natural hedging strategy for changing weather, etc., now becomes their trap. They've got one thing, if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. These people have nothing to fall back on. So if there is any event, be it climatic or be it rises in fossil fuel prices, not only can they not go back, but they're stuck in debt. And here is that simple thing of how we start to become entwined in the world. By making simple decisions that seem right, you start to be in a position where you can no longer go back. Because if you stop using fertilizers, your productivity crashes. So you're everything going wrong all at once. Oh, sorry, on here. So here's just a few things. Firstly, the people who come to give their wisdom are very much, excuse my spelling if you see any misspellings, history as a direction. And it's about progress and about growth. And it's about we all want to be developed, whatever that is, that sort of narrative. Secondly, we're the director. You know, it's our brilliance that brought us to this point, our creative, intellectual brilliance. And if you're going and telling other people how to do it right, it's great ego boost to your own narrative of your own heroic position in the world. Lock-in is generally the ability, or your inability, to change one thing in a very complex system without starting to affect something else that you depend on. And in a very complex world like we live in, this could be, and I'll give some examples later, this could be really because we're dependent on constant flows of things through our system to keep us alive, to keep the light on, etc. Anything that you do too major to your economic system, consciously, even if you could comprehend the complexity, could quite likely start kick you around the back of the head in a way you didn't notice. You've very little room for maneuver. Irreversibility. This is a thermodynamic term. This is about energy, but it's also a very real thing. You can't go back. You don't, just removing those things doesn't bring us back to where we were before. And here is an example. If you imagine that all the Intel chips, no, this isn't a realistic thing, it's just, all the Intel chips introduced in the last 10 years, let's say they just failed. We wouldn't be back to where we were 10 years ago. We would have no grid, our banking system would go down, we would have a food security crisis, we would have major social unrest. You ask the question, how can something that's only 10 years in the system, because you're giving that cutoff, cause such chaos? We were fine before it. And this is about that sort of emergence and change and interconnectedness. So when we're going to talk about collapse, I'm going to be very specific and say, well, not that specific, and say, what's collapsing is the globalized economy. Okay, so the first thing we might say, what is? Well, it's an integrated thing. It's an integrated accessing, storing, processing, and distribution system with associated infrastructure. And it's what all of us are tied together by. And it also is what ties together China and Ireland and the United States. It's what, from Zambia to, Peru, we're all part of it, more or less. And our measure of being part of it is also our system dependency on it. It's delocalized. Now, we are very much, because we're human, we like the human narrative, we're prone to the human narrative and drama of my country, the American government, the American economy, the Irish economy. But what we mean by the globalized economy is something different. It's an emergent property of all of these economies acting together, so that it has an independence and a life beyond our economy, individual economies. And while all individual economies in some way help to be part of it, its dynamics and what it provides and distributes is globalized, truly. It maintains our globalized civilization, and that is really the globalized economy and all the things it gives, and our narratives and worldviews that grew up in the expectation that this is normal, that this is what happens. We can say it's been growing in complexity, and we heard from Professor Tainter and Nicole Foss some of the things about that. There's all sorts of ways we can define it, but it keeps growing. More integration, etc., etc. It's self-organizing. It's like those birds in flight. They don't know about aerodynamics of flight. They didn't set out to form a narrow shape. Each bird adapted in its own position with maybe a sense of hierarchy, but also just the path of least effort, the easiest position to be in. And what emerges is a macro structure. And that's the same for our globalized economy. It is lots of institutions, individuals, people, formations, even ideas, and all sorts of identity groups, physical groups, interacting together. There's nothing in control, but there are common bonds or paths of interaction through infrastructures, historical narratives, cultural narratives, etc. That means that nobody controls the global economy. It means nobody controls your economy or my economy, the one that I live in Ireland. It is a coalescence at any moment of various pressures, pushes, thises and that's, most of which we're unaware of. So when we ask, why won't the government do something, and we combine that with what we say about lock-in and about self-organization, we start to get to think, governments can't do anything because they can't do anything. And the reason we talk grandly is because actually their main job is to keep the things stable and to stop, by electors or other things, disturbing a momentary equilibrium. Because it's far easier to destroy something than it is to actually build complexity. You know, there's many more ways to break things than there are to build it. So that is the function of government, or all of us to some degree, in any part of the system. We've heard about supply chains, and we've heard about lock-in. Now, lock-in, really, one of the major one is the growth economy. You know, we may know it's killing us in many ways, but we can't move out of it because it's too complex, and if we started pulling the plug on our monetary system, you know, it's quite likely we'd have a food crisis. So these are some of the features. There are many more, but I just want to talk a little bit about, you know, going back a little bit. And here are two pictures. They're actually a little bit later than the period I'm talking about, but you get the idea. This poor little village, hovel, the roof falling in, and this woman out working hard in the fields. Now, the reason I'm choosing France is because, you know, we're back about 1700, 18th century. I think France is a really, you know, it's part of the developing, busy new world. It's got Versailles, it's got the beginnings of great mathematicians, and all of this sort of thing is going on. It's a happening place. Well, history gives us the happening place, at least in its headlines, but in the back print we realize most people were very poor, very disconnected, and weren't getting up to much in terms of, you know, the wide French culture. There were most people were rural, 18 general famines and hundreds of local famines in the 18th century. Why was that? Well, if you are localized and self-sufficient, you have a problem of, if there's a bad flood or anything like that, what happens? You bear all the cost yourself. You've got no reserves, you don't have cash, which you might exchange with someone else, you don't have markets, you don't have transport links, you don't have the infrastructure in which to manage those risks. So, you know, storage limitations, you just remain poor. Now, one of the great things about starting to link up with other towns, with transport, with the money, which it can be your universal, not just store of wealth, but it's a token that you can all work with together, markets and institutions, is that your risks are shared. And now, if there's a crisis in one place, boom, it's dispersed towards the others, and you hopefully can survive. But that's not really the biggest benefit in terms of how people saw the evolution of globalization. If you have a surplus and you start to have roads and things, you start to sell your surplus, it's the most efficient use of it. If you've got money, you can store it. As the network gets bigger, because this is of a benefit, you can start to build markets. If people are cooperating, you start to have specialization. And because you have a bigger market, somebody can specialize in very particular things. Because you start to need foci for people to do their transactions. You start to bring people together. They can start to do more complex things. They can start to have more surpluses because you're finding more efficiencies and new productivity. So knowledge, technology, levels of integration, all of these start to grow, and it starts to bring this cycle, this spiral of benefits. Now, network size, of course, you can bring people in, but as we've seen, the other way to grow your network is to just go and grab it. That has a long history, of course, as well. But the real thing that all of these need they need increasing energy and increasing resources. So we drive this around and we keep growing. Provided your energy and your resources are on top, there's no reason why this process shouldn't keep growing, getting bigger and bigger, until you either get sort of severe declining marginal returns, you get issues in energy, or you have some sort of internal dynamics to the whole system. Now, this is where things start to go because I hadn't filled in things. See this graph on top? That is gross world product from 1961 to 1997 or something. And it's the frequency, the number of times the growth rate was, say, between 3% and 3.49%. The number of times, well, here it was 7 times between, at this level. You get the gist. Now, it's an interesting point. For most of human history, there wasn't growth, or it was local. It happened in different places at different times. Between about 1500 and 1870, it was about 0.06%, so much lower than we'd know. And then from about 1880, it started to rise at what is a remarkably constant rate. Okay? I mean, now it's normal growth is 3 or 4%. Why? Why not 27%? Then drop by 36, then up by something else. Why not oscillate randomly like this? Why not have any other dynamic? What you see is remarkable stability. And if you plot, there's another graph that I have that's kind of all OECD and everything thrown in, and it's a remarkable curve. You see a few outliners, big depressions, but really remarkable stability. And part of the reason we know that we're in a zone of stability is because if you start going outside this just by a few percent, you start to cause major stresses in the system. You either have social stresses, you have financial stresses, etc. So something remarkably stable, we could say. Even despite the change, it's been remarkably stable. And of course, it's been at a rate we could adapt to, because here we are, adapted to it. In fact, we've built worlds out of it. People are investing their pensions 40, 50 years hence on the basis of it. People are buying mortgages. People are doing all sorts of things, how they educate their children. All sorts of things are based on that we have had this remarkable stability. And of course, this has taken energy. And of course, in a very direct way, if you're looking at systems, you kind of go, well, any system in ecology, in engines or whatever, energy is always the key. And here you have complexity more generally. This value here, see here, this is energy per second per gram. Okay, so we're talking about energy flow per unit mass, okay, going through. And what we see is that if we try and look at rising complexity, we see that it rises, stars or planets are more complex than stars, animals or plants more complex than planets, etc., all the way up to society. And what we see is, firstly, that you have this growing and growing flow-through of more and more energy per unit mass. So our civilization is much, much smaller than, say, the weight of our civilization than, say, the weight of our planet. But there's much, much more. Consequently, there's much more energy flowing through the complexity of our planet per unit mass. Now, the first thing about this is total thermodynamics. This is what happens. Complexity forms because it's not intentional, it's just how it happens. The universe abhors an energy gradient, and it's trying to get rid of that energy gradient, and the fastest way to get rid of an energy gradient is complexity. That's why life forms, etc. It's dumping heat. It's dumping that concentrated energy into the universe faster than something less complex. There is another thing about complexity and about that value, energy per unit mass per unit time. It also means it is more and more prone to decay, anthropic decay. Okay? So the more complex things you have in general, the more likely it is to decay. More quickly, it's more likely to quickly decay than something less complex. And we'll come back and we'll see why that's important. So I wanted to talk a bit about supply chains because, as was said earlier, we don't see complexity. It's attenuated in objects, and we lose it. So this is quite unrealistic, but I'm just using it as an example because it's a calculation you can do. FASTA, okay, one of the places where I apply my trade. How many things does it require to work? Okay, this is very hand-washy. Well, we booked a flight. This is over the last while. Number 2 is we have a computer, we have a pencil, we have a salary. And actually, if you take individual different things, there's about 136 things. Okay? Let's assume that the computer also takes 136 things to make it. And one of those things is a microprocessor, and it also takes 136 things to make it. And that one of those things is a lithography system. So we're just going down 136 down, but we're going to stop here at 5 levels. Any idea how many economic transactions are involved in that? 47 billion. Okay? Now, a computer has far more than 136 components. A motor car has about 15,000. And about 40 or 50 of those parts are engines and are motors, complex things in themselves. And when we talk about a motor car having 15,000 components, we're not talking about the very complex fabrication system, the robots and all of that. We're not talking about the office people and their computers. We're not talking about on and on. So what we see is the very simple things around us that are attenuated have billions, trillions and trillions and trillions of economic interactions crisscrossing the world, embedded behind them. Now, don't worry about that. Now, the thing is, that is a total miss. I was trying to get the calculation to show you the size. That's not how it works, as we'll see. But the first thing is, because of all of that, our welfare is smeared all over the globe. That's part of what we mean by the globalized economy. There's no end to supply chains. Requires globalized economies of scale. It needs lots of economically active people to engage in all of this to make it all viable. It needs consumers and makers and purchasers crisscrossing the world. That's why it keeps going. That cycle of more and more people, more and more wealth, more and more activity allows more and more complexification, more and more diverse roles, more and more economic activity. It's recursive. I'll show you what a recursive means in a second. Self-organized and delocalized. So here's an example of your mobile phone. There where all your base parts of it come from. You got a bit of crude oil there, bromine, zinc, whatever. North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia. It's everywhere. Now, that isn't the beginning journey of your mobile phone. Because in order to get all of those metals, what did you need? You need machines and mines and specialty chemicals. And that is why we talk about recursive. It all goes back. It's not a beginning and an end. It's all mixed up and interacting. And we start to see that, to make, say, this, let's say, tantalum viable, you need lots of equipment to mine the tantalum. It's a pretty specialized place. You also need a good market for tantalum out in the world. If they were only making it for my mobile phone, it would be a very expensive mobile phone, and we probably couldn't afford the network. So that's what, trying to get a sense of the complexity of things. Now, critical infrastructure. It's all of that hard stuff that we think of: roads, the grid, power stations, water and waste systems, all of that. And in a sense, when we saw that FASTA diagram and all of those interactions, behind that was a common infrastructure, more or less. Money is a very important one, which is an infrastructure. It's a cultural, social infrastructure as well as a physical one. Energy, communications, food, water and waste, all of these things. Now, there's some things we can say about them. The first is they have evolved at the scale and capacity to deal with the world as it is now. In other words, or even a bigger one, because things are built in growth. So I built my communications network because I expect traffic to increase 5% per year for the next 10 years. Or my sewerage system is big enough, I've built new houses, new parts of cities, and the pipes are wide enough to expect, that amount of waste, all of these things. Greater scale and complexity. Things like the grid, or information backbone networks, are the most complex things on the planet, or amongst the most complex things on the planet, most resource-intensive things on the planet. And we say most complex, we immediately think of, even more prone to faster decay of components, of elements. They have, therefore, lifetimes, relatively short lifetimes. They rely on just-in-time delivery. So when we look at, say, an energy system, and we think of energy, in a way, in a modern economy, it's not energy that we're after, really. It's a range of things. We're looking for maintenance flows, operation flows, one of which is energy, okay? It's only one part, because, if you lose a switching system and you can't replace it, it doesn't matter how much oil you can afford or gas you can afford, the system doesn't work. It also obviously it expects, most resource intensive and specialized, least substitutability. If you have a very complex component, it's quite likely that very few people, if that component maker goes down for whatever reason, that very few other people can make it. Okay? That's the nature of complexity. So, for instance, if you remember the volcano in Iceland, one of the consequences was that 3 BMW plants went down in Germany. Why? Because they missed a component. Now, for BMW, they obviously never thought that something like this could block out their airspace for X many days. So for them it was quite normal, but 3 plants shut down. Now, this is one of the interesting things. I don't know if the word monopoly is the right word. Maybe you can suggest one. But our most critical infrastructure has no operational alternative in real terms. If I don't like this grid that supplies this place, I can't just go and turn it onto another grid. Or if I don't like pooing in this water, in this sewerage system, there's not another sewerage system that I can use in preference. Now, you might say, yes, you can go off grid, you can use a composting toilet, but we're talking about the large scale for society. There's no operational alternative. So our most critical infrastructure are effectively physical monopolies. Massive embedded investment, globalized economies of scale. In other words, in a way, for our phones, for our grid, we're all paying a little bit. And that makes it viable, and we can pay for that little bit because we're exchanging our labours across the globe. And they can make the things we want because they have critical infrastructure and it's working for them, and they can afford it because we're interacting with them. So it's part of this network of systems that are... somebody get me water, please, I feel I'm drying out. So the other thing about it is these systems require discretionary and non-discretionary use. Now, what I mean by that is, you know, when people sometimes say, you know what we need to do is get rid of all the rubbish we're consuming, okay, and use all the good stuff, you know, the important things. Well, the thing is that infrastructure is viable because, you know, we're texting, using YouTube, playing video games, as much as because businesses using it for critical work. In other words, it requires us all. It requires that global integrated use. It makes no distinction. It's viable because we're buying rubbish. Now, here is, following the attacks in September in 2001, there became a new awareness about critical infrastructure interdependencies. And, of course, what you find is you don't have to look very hard. This is a simplified version of one person's analysis. They're all tied up together, okay? You know, your water, waste and water requires electricity and power. It requires chlorine for things, et cetera, never mind repair and updating electricity. All of these things you can see. I just want to put a little bit of a note here in case I forget to mention it later. When we're talking about crises or collapse, there's a popular narrative of, you know, that Mad Max, that we're all going to go around killing each other and jumping on each other's head for the last shred of clothes or the piece of rice from their pocket. That may be, but actually civil conflicts like that don't tend to last too long. They burn out pretty quickly. A far more greater threat is water and waste. We're very clean people. We've got a very clean water system on getting rid of our waste. But if that goes, because your electricity goes, number one is we've no vulnerability to, we're no good at fighting many of the diseases that people in much dirtier parts of the world have. And it is likely to be one of the biggest, or the biggest, sources of human mortality in the Western world, in the developed world, is water and waste. And it's one of the things that we have to work out what to do. Changing work and the sidelined necessity. Here's another point that what complexity gave us. Now, 1911, the UK census. What were people doing? Here's the largest occupations: domestic service, agriculture, and coal mining. One, human service, in the service of others. Well, service is probably the wrong word. Agriculture, i.e. energy for us, for ourselves, and direct energy extraction. Pretty basic stuff. And this is 1911. The UK already had an empire. It was doing lots of other things. Now, in 2008, sales personnel, middle managers, and teachers. What is that about? They're managers of complexity. They are the people in between exchanges. They are the people trying to manage this monster that's jumping around. And they're the specialists in trying to school people to manage this very complex world. So you see something profound has happened there, and you'll probably see where we're going later on. What do we do with our money? Now, like 1911, but this is from a survey that was done in 1904, about the same time, in urban Britain. How much were people spending on food of their income? 63%. All right? That's lots of people worked on food, lots of people spent most of their income in food. Now, it's 10.4%. Much, much less. So what are we looking at now? And here's just another sort of slightly different look. This is US agricultural workers. Now, farm share of total population, up around 40. It was even higher, this is, it had been up here. Down, 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 down it goes. Now nobody's working on producing food. Virtually nobody. I want you just to note, because we're going to come back to it, Great Depression, 20 plus people, just over 20% of people were working on that sort of basic food production. Now, work and delocalization. Well, we've delocalized, as we keep on saying, of inputs and outputs, dependent on globalized economies of scale. Now, sorry, just on the first thing, what we use to interact with the world, we make our living. We think of it in terms of, I make widgets, so what's important is I make widgets and the things I need. But it also requires the things we take for granted. And part of that is all of that, what I've called before an operational fabric of our world. It's money system is there. There's electricity if I need it. There's legal contract being enforced. There is a global system. All of these things that if I'm starting up a business, I don't even have to think about because they're there. So that is effectively the difference between me and you guys working and what's happening in Kyrgyzstan to those people. Our operational costs, just to allow us to work, are much, much higher because we have all of these other associated things that make us viable. And obviously we're more specialized, that's the higher operational costs of doing work, globalized infrastructure, but we'll move on. And one of the final things I want to just look at is sort of more a behavioral, biological thing. Nicole touched on some of it earlier on. And our kind of sphere of attachment. And I've done it in terms of space and time. Space and time. And in the middle, I call it my mesolimbic me point. That's about me now, what I want. Blah. And a lot of this is pretty much part of our biology. It's culturated a little bit as well. And as we go forward in time, basically we've evolved to be pretty interested in what happens along here. And we've evolved to pay most of our attention to family community. Now, something remarkable happened. Because in evolutionary terms, it's this amazing thing that I give something that is essentially has no intrinsic value, and I send it over the world in the hope that somebody I don't know gives me something or other. It's pretty amazing. And that expansion in who I'm willing to trade with, because I expect completion, and the idea that we'd invest in mortgages and pensions is a recent thing, certainly at this sort of level of complexity, and it's what allowed the complexity to grow. And the first thing is we see, well, what was happening? Now, I didn't put wealth there, but we've had the stability that we talked about, that globalizing growth, relatively stable, rate we could adapt to. We started to realize, this is how things work. We got used to it. Hey, my parents are getting a pension. I probably am, And risk dispersal. We talked earlier on about risk. In time, how do we risk disperse? We get mortgages, we get pensions. We have a society that absorbs risks for us in terms of gives us more economic activity. So if I lose this job, somebody's out there trying to find another one for me, or at least the system is. And more wealth, because we had more discretionary income. We weren't really worried about losing that little bit extra. When somebody said, you should put it in a pension, we went, okay, that's all right. And likewise in space, wealth, there were benefits of cooperation. If you trade with me, and we all trade with each other, we all become a little bit wealthier. We'll find new opportunities. And we learned that there might be somebody who's a cheater. Now, this is a very human thing, basic foundational evolutionary behavioral thing. There's always a cheater. So you don't want a system where the cheaters overrule the system or it'll collapse. And the cheaters don't overrule the system. One is because it's in everybody's benefit, more or less, to cooperate. But we also made globalized institutions of trust, like the IMF, or the European Union, or global trade agreements, or the list goes on. And we have global legal systems, all of these things that in proxy of not knowing you personally, or my community not knowing you personally, will act on our behalf and punish the cheaters. And as long as you have growth over time, you can assume, without thinking, you can get habitualized to, there is a global system, my contracts will be dealt with if somebody cheats, and we can kind of forget about our community, etc., etc. The other side is, on that radius of cooperation, is the economy. For families, we generally have a gift economy, or we're close friends. Then barter might be the next stage, where you know somebody, and I know I can come back to you if your chickens are not chickeny enough. And then we go on to currency, national currency, and foreign exchange, and so on. So if that is the evolutionary the psychodrama of evolutionary behavior, the mechanism or the means that what that brought about was, again, this interaction with abstract money of no intrinsic value, or credit of effectively, a promise. And it's kind of interesting because I was reading before I came here, and I did have it in one of the original slides. It's from Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. And he was a great pamphleteer. And in the 1690s, he was writing about credit. Because here you had Britain and France sniping at each other and war. But this was really expensive. War, paying out of what you have, out of your current income, is a very hard job. And Britain did something, or England at the time. What did they do? They learned a little bit from the Dutch, and they discovered credit. And Daniel Defoe is a great writer and observer, because this is really the beginning of credit. This is amazing. Armies march on this thing. Whole worlds change because of this credit. And he's got, you're kind of going like that old phrase, would you credit it? And it really marks that point of the discovery of credit as what will be a permanent institution. Because what's happening is you start to have growth, you have expansionism in, it's the beginning of Britain's great empire and all of that. So people start to read into it and think, hey, credit is a good thing, like the Dutch had, at the time of, their glorious period, they were having effectively, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of year bonds because they expected the stability to last. Now, this is where we get a bit ropey. Things start to go down. So I just want to mention peak oil. There you have, this is your normal curve that you might see, or something like it. Here is your net energy, because we have less. That, of course, even if you got that, is a total mythology, because it depends on lots of other things. It depends on that globalized economy. It's assumed you can extract oil out of the economy, and your infrastructure won't be affected. Your money system won't be affected. You'll be able to keep on some level of investment. You'll be able to continue paying the same price, etc., etc. So they are effectively the assumptions in any of those curves. Even the net energy. The net energy only deals with the net energy. So it's all the other things are in that curve. A whole stable world. So nothing changes except we have less oil. So as a sort of physics person, you kind of go, or in an ecosystem, you kind of go, okay, you're going to have less energy, it can't grow. It starts to make sense. Intuitively, that's what you think. In looking at economies, you say, well, because it's non-discretionary, it starts to suck out of the discretionary economy. Also, if you're importing it, you're spending more and more and more on it. So you start to contract your economy in a very economic term. So you can come at it from either angle and you get the same place. You're in trouble. And if you have a credit system, because you're doing things in the never-never, it must contract. So my issue really is more worried about food. Because I think, we can drop. I think, as was said, we are going to see a big drop in energy use, and indeed other energy, across the board, because you go into a very severe economic contraction. But food is an interesting one because I think we're already on the edge of things, and we have very little slack. And obviously we've got production is strained, and it will become more strained on average just for those reasons. Demand is rising, as you know, and we've very tightly optimized production to consumption systems. Now, that's I'm saying there's an awful lot in that. They are phase-locked. That means that, in Ireland, in the US, you're not producing to keep yourself fed over the year. You're producing for global markets. So however you plant in whatever cycle, it mightn't keep you, you might have gluts, if you're just to live in it, and then emptiness in other parts, because it's not designed to keep you fed throughout the year. It's, as you know, it's just-in-time delivery, etc., that there are inputs, that there are seeds. You need to keep buying seeds every year, inputs, etc. And you're dependent on the international financial system, you're dependent on credit, you're dependent on subsidies. In Europe, we have vast subsidies in agriculture that are really complex, that effectively farms are insolvent, up to the rise in debt, and there is virtually no resilience in the system. It will break. And here is an example that I use of lock-in. I think this is really, really risky, even for European countries. Now, the problem is that by supermarkets driving down prices, which is really affecting farmers' ability to invest in anything, they're effectively in servitude, debt servitude and everything else, they are making food prices lower, which is helping, say, the Irish economy, because people have that bit more money to spend on servicing their debt and their heat. And that is good for the Irish government and for the bond market and everything else. If we want to fix the food system, even if we could, for lots of other reasons, very difficult, we'd have to raise prices of food. We'd have to raise prices, somehow decouple the debt from the farmers, a whole range of things. We'd have to get rid of the supermarkets, or at least do something very radical. But the net benefit would be rising prices and depressed productivity, because you might get productivity up in 10 years, but if you pull out those systems now, you just have a drop in productivity. So you'd have a huge increase in prices. So that's an example of lock-in. And then the risks, declines in production, declines in purchasing power. People have no money, basically, can't afford it. And I mean, this not being able to afford it is something certainly we're very familiar with in Ireland, because about 150 years ago, we lost over a quarter of the population to famine. But there was food here. There was grain, there were all sorts of things. But that was being exported because people couldn't afford to buy it. And this is quite normal. Amartya Sen has written a lot about this in terms of the world today, and historically in terms of, famines aren't always, or very often are not about food production. They're about distribution, they're about affordability and other things. System failures in production, food left rotting in the fields, all of these other things. bank grid, etc. And one of the things, and I'll mention this later, that we're trying to look at is we're trying to do top and mid-set level emergency preparations. And one of the things, of course, is rationing systems. You know, for Ireland as a model, because it's relatively, well, in relative terms, easier to try and do than the US. But one of the things you realize is that the rationing we did in the 1940s is very different to now, because the changes required of the farmers are much different. They're in a much more locked-in position. So if you botch that, you could have not only major social unrest, but also a fight back of who's creaming the system, who's making off with it, etc. So debt and imbalances, and everybody seems to be interested in Ireland, with the poster boys, of going over the edge. Severe over-indebtedness, variable ease deflation, barely begun the fall, next wave of defaults. Well, next wave of defaults, you know, in Ireland, you know, there's all of these mortgages that haven't, you know, they're effectively being kept on. If you pay a cent on your mortgage, they'll say it's operational. Okay? Nobody wants to pull the plug. We have a huge personal debt. If you take Irish total indebtedness, all right, it's over 10 times GDP. And we have a budget deficit, excluding the bank bailout, which makes it 30-something% this year, of about 10 or 11%. You know, and as you probably heard, bonds were trading at up to 9% 2 days ago. 10-year bonds, I think there were. So anybody looking at that would kind of know, you know, there's only one way. Now they're doing austerity, and we've been doing it for a while. We're also saying, you know, the exports are going to get us out. But every bloody country on the planet is all saying we're all going to be exporting. You know? So, you know, we can't all sort of make our zillions from that. We don't have to go back to the markets until March or April, because we're more or less fully funded until then. But we will probably have to go back then. At the moment, it will be the IMF as a junior partner coming in. It's most likely going to be the European Union who will try and shore up the thing, shore it up at least for 5 minutes. Conventional QE, I'm talking about here in the US or in Britain, where they've supposedly QE'd 200 billion. It's a confidence trick, but I don't mean that I mean it in the broad sense of, you know, it's what we do to make ourselves feel confident. You know, so it's all its meanings there. Imbalances imply toxic codependencies. Now, just little old Ireland. If Ireland does a full default on all its bank debt, German banks are down to the tune of a third of Ireland's GDP. Okay? Now, French and German banks are up to their hock in Spanish debt, in Eastern European debt, in all sorts of debt. China, I'm always surprised when people talk about peak oil, that they kind of assume that China just keeps going. Remember, China itself is part of the globalized economy and is dependent upon it. So it too is going to feel the force of its collapse. But for the moment, for the US, China needs its workers working and producing. And when Europe starts to go under, and then the US and other countries, China is going to have incredible headaches. So peak oil economics even apart. So we're in a deflationary period now. Peak oil would be deflationary because it stops you growing and it starts to make debts more and more difficult to pay off. But it may not be noticed, and this is one of my fears. I'd like people to think this is a peak oil food ecological problem rather than a problem caused by bankers, as how the popular mind might construe such things. Why? Because blame isn't a great thing. We need a narrative that people can say, well, we all screwed up. And it just makes things easier for people to move forward. Demand may fall deeply and even real prices. Peak oil and peak energy, I don't think we're going to be, I think we probably already have most of the renewable energy infrastructure in terms of wind turbines that we will ever see on the planet. Likewise, I think we're going to see actually major degradation of a lot of other types of energy infrastructure. But food, again, has the greatest price support. Because, firstly, I think it's going to fall quite a bit. But unlike turning off a factory, when we turn off food, you start to have a real crisis. We just do not have, I think, the slack. And it will be, I think, where the greatest price support is. Eventually, you can't do deflation forever. And remember, talking about globally, US might hang on for longer. But other countries are going to start reissuing currency, hyperinflating, doing all sorts of things. It's going to be a much more difficult market to read. One of the things that we've been talking about or trying to get talked about in Europe is what you might call unconventional quantitative easing, which is where we give everybody in Europe per capita money into their hand effectively, and we tell, and the deal is, if you owe money, you use it to pay it off. If you don't, that's fine. Now, it causes inflation. People with small balances are partially compensated with the inflation because they're getting the money into their hands and other people are wiped. And that is an idea. I know Richard, my colleague, has been arguing for it, and there's some people, I don't know if it's the Kansas Fed, Mosler, and others, I don't know if you know them, they've been talking about it as well. But the real problem ultimately isn't debt-based money. It's part of our problem, but fiat currency is a problem. Why is fiat currency a problem? Well, if you start to see we're going down, there are also risks of infrastructure collapse, there are risks of less food, there are risks of things falling apart. And we all have the same amount of money, and it's all not debt-based. Or we could all print money, each of you, to whatever degree. It sets up the conditions where we start either stealth printing or going for a grab for whatever is left before the thing starts to collapse. And, how that pans out, I'm not quite sure. But it's effectively one of those things where if more people start to think that others might do it, it increases the risk that they might do it. And one of the early things, I think, is bank intermediation failure, and we barely avoided that. Financing credit, loss of global economies of scale. All of these things start to jump in. But ultimately, if you lose that trust over currencies, you lose our supply chains. And you lose the ability to enforce things as well. Now, this is not the original slide, but I just want to talk a bit about critical infrastructure risk. We said before that it's the most complex stuff. It's built for a growth economy at this scale, so it takes a little bit of money from all of us to pay for it. Well, if there's less and less economic activity, and we can't afford it, we stop using our mobile phones, or we use them very rarely, or I borrow yours, we collectively use them. Or factories stop using the sewerage system that they're paying rates for. Or, and we've started a research project a bit on this, which I'll mention, which is, if you think in Europe, you've got pipelines coming from Russia all the way across Europe for gas. Then they get to the countries, and they go into power stations, and then they go from power stations onto grids. So there's the fuel, and there's this big fixed operating cost. Okay? What happens if fewer and fewer people can afford it? We're assuming money has stability at the moment, okay, that we could still use it. Fewer and fewer people can afford to pay for their electricity. And one of the things in that is, we're seeing it already in Ireland, we buy services long relative to food. In other words, I pay my electricity bill every 2 months. Okay, if I have a choice tomorrow, feed the family, pay the bill, I'll kind of put off the bill. Okay, that is that, remember that circle we showed, the time horizon. When it gets tighter, it starts to retract. You come closer to the family, closer in time. You look after the present more than the future. So down goes your investment, and then you get this situation. Spending falls, but you have to pay the operational cost for the whole system. So the cost per unit starts to rise for each user that is left. More drop out, and the cost rises again because you've got to pay the fixed costs. And once your fixed costs can't be paid for by the people, it doesn't matter that people are still buying electricity, it's just unviable. So, ba-dum, down it goes. Okay? Likewise, your IT infrastructure. We're all using it, a little bit here, a little bit there. It's built for our scale. If it had been built for India's scale, we could probably deal with it longer. But it's not. It's built for us and our big bandwidth and all of that. And basically, we can't afford either components like mobile phones and computers start to get more expensive, or they might get cheaper if actually probably get cheaper, but our use of them in terms of where there's a cost starts to get less and less. But the system is viable. My phone system is viable because it has its wide network availability. If less and less are using it, or we're all sharing the phone to use at an odd time for very important occasions, and we're not working because we've all lost our jobs, well, then, again, the same dynamic, fewer and fewer people are using it. Prices rise per user for the fixed costs, and out it goes. So that, then, is the individual part of the infrastructure, but we saw it's highly coupled. So they start to knock each other over. So the grid goes down and you start to have sewerage backing up and you can't clean it and you don't have water, or problems with water leading to other problems. Actually, before I do that, there's one more thing which, again, as I said, the slides weren't finished on this because it's an older thing that I was actually fixing up here earlier on because the other stuff went away. Remember I mentioned about employment and food. What's the difference between the Great Depression and us now? Well, in the Great Depression, there were lots of people, say 25%, producing food without lots of fancy inputs. Relatively easy to manage. We have about, in America, there's about 5% of people involved in energy and food with loads of inputs that they rely on. So if all we're spending is just to be food, and a bit of debt servicing and a bit of this, that, and the other, what do we all do? Our jobs vanish, vaporize. Okay? And it's all right to think we could all be back in the fields. Yes, we probably all have to get back into the fields. But that's not something that happens on a Tuesday morning. That is a vast cultural thing. It's people moving. It's people, it's a huge thing. So that effectively, there's no economy left. And if you add to the supply chain risks, that actually just suddenly starts to make us both unfunctional in the roles we were in, pretty unadapted to whatever we're going to do. Where are we as a society? Where are they living in urban places? And even as, I don't know if any of you know a website called Zone 5. But it's Guy Graham Strout, who's a permaculture guy, lives down in West Cork in Ireland. And he makes the point that, look, he said, I'm a very good permaculture food grower. I have loads of skills. It would be a hell of a stretch for me, on my own, to keep myself going through 160 days of the year and around the other side, having to supply my own seeds and all of that. In other words, real things. He's more or less near the very top of people, of the skill level for that. Where are the rest of us? And you can say, yes, community, but this is the best in the community. Everybody else is going to be way down. In fact, most will just be wildered. So this, again, comes back, it reminds us about complementary currencies. Why do complementary currencies work? Well, there's two things. One is, if you have a hard currency out here, complementary currencies can allow you to have some economic activity and local economic activity, and that hardness allows you to bring in things from the outside fixed, stable world. If the outside fixed, stable world starts to go haywire in terms of money, and all you're left with is what you have locally, making a local currency will not make you food, will not give you skills. It's not that in the future we may not have local currencies, but in the interim, that idea is we're not producing, we are not those people. And here is the next, so that's as we see this convergence of things. And the final thing, and I'll conclude, is, now this is really simplified, but I kind of find it one of the more sort of things. Now this is really simplified, but I kind of find it one of the more sort of things, is that let's say how people change mood. This is a very simple model, sort of an S curve, a sigmoid curve there. And here you are. Do you believe that economic growth is going to continue? You're all down here. We are. We're all down here. We have that belief. Do governments believe this? By and large, they're down there. Or no, well, there's very few of them. There's very few of us basically down here. Belief in no growth. Now, we're going to start, if we're going to start going out into the world, our governments are going to start, and they say, oh my God, we're not coming back. We're going to have food security risks. This is really emergency. We're in an emergency situation. People panic. So I've used the bond market as just a simple idea of the future. So we needn't be too specific. So energy and food prices, warnings, Obama is warning. Look, an Obama warning is worth 100 times my Prime Minister's warning, because he has more status in the world, has bigger effect, is heard more. So it depends who's saying it. Warnings, stock and bond markets start to go jittery. Then people respond. They start dumping assets and saying, what can I buy that's resilient? I want some land, I want some gold, I want some this. But there's not that many sellers of land. And there's something like, if you exclude derivatives, there's something like 300 billion of stuff, of some sort of notional assets floating around. So it starts jumping out. Starting to get fearful. They see more things dropping, prices dropping. You got to get out, it goes, and suddenly you have boom, and things start to collapse. In other words, action causes the collapse of many of the things you want to do. And this is also true, like when Nicole is going around telling people what they might do. We do that in Ireland, we do it a bit in Britain. You kind of know, you're kind of going there, if you all do this, we're a bit screwed. You start to take down the banking system, and you kind of go, then what the heck do we do, So whether it's the local level or a national level, you'll see why governments, well, there's other reasons, obviously, why governments won't do anything. And this is why what we're trying to do, and we're always happy for help and support. You see it's at the end. Oh, there you go. That was something I didn't put in, but there you go. You can have a look at that. This is what we're trying to do. We kind of realized, number one, is that, well, we've been going to government and European Commission and saying, we have big trouble. We can't go in there and say, here is the trouble, and offer nothing, and not offer a map. Now, the map isn't saying what you do. The map is sort of saying, here are options. Here's how to get a handle on something as complex as this. You need to give people a tool. That is presuming you've brought them to a stage where they realize there's a problem. And one tool is how you manage what pre-preparations you can do. Now, this has a problem as well, because ideally, I don't think governments are the real people you want. And actually, one of the things we're using for mapping this is from the US military, which is their Star Tides country in a box. What do you do if you're in a collapsed country? You know, how do you... I saw your face. You saw that sort of truncated... How do you truncate a problem so that it doesn't overwhelm you? We're also looking at aid development workers, you know, big aid projects. What do you do in a sort of crisis situation? But that's only one part. And I don't want to, the last thing I want is these sort of things securitized. In other words, they're given to military. They need to be, what you might call, they need to have public ownership. But there's a lot to do. I mean, one of the questions that we talked about in terms of shit and waste and water is actually, you know, most people, because psychologically, if all shit starts to bubble up through their floors, through their cities or whatever, that is about as psychologically traumatic as you're going to get beyond starving. That is not, it is deep within us, you know. You need to have a suite of things that people can do with no fancy stuff around. You need to give them a package. You need to be able to say, okay, you know, there might even be jobs in it. You know, this is fertilizer. I mean, this is high quality stuff. But we need to answer those questions in a simple way. So, I'm going to, as I say, I haven't done the conclusions. We're in the other thing. So I'll just mention a few conclusions and hope you feel you have to conclude, I suppose. I think that we're going into a major systemic collapse. I think that whether it was just deflation, or whether it was and the indebtedness, or whether it was the oil on top of that, it would be especially traumatic because we are so delocalized. There is nothing behind it. We can't go back and do the things we did in 1930 in terms of local currencies. We don't have local this, that, or the other. The fact that it's a convergent issue with food in there as well, the fact that we're so complex, the fact that the cost of our system is so high compared to the people you saw in Kyrgyzstan, makes us especially vulnerable, not them. If I wanted to know where in the world I would go, you know, to be reasonably all right, I'd hang out with them. So the problem, I think, is in a sense that, you know, in the sustainability narrative, or even the peak oil narrative, we thought, oh, we need currencies, we need local food growing, we need this, that. These are all brilliant. But they won't do. You know, we have that much time, and we're facing something that big. And we've got to think in a much more, how would one put it? Large scale. That doesn't mean government necessarily, but in terms of what you're trying to do. And in some ways it makes it easier. In some ways more difficult. But I think for most people, I think that, well, the things I would say are important, despite apart from all the technical things. The first is that we have a narrative. We get out a narrative that we are all collectively have a responsibility for this. You know, it wasn't the bankers that done it to us. You know, the greedy people. That doesn't mean we don't keep an eye out. We keep a very sharp eye out for who's creaming the system and how they get away with it or not. But that the narrative is a collective one, that we all screwed up. And I found, say, in Ireland, and even in the current crisis, comparing it with Greece and other things, I think we're going to have big trouble very soon. But I do think one of the things that eased it into it, and we've had austerity first in Europe, and amongst the first in the world, is number one is it was recent, and people feel a bit guilty for their tackiness, for the crap things they built, for this, that, and the other, and for their credit card bills and all of this. Do you know what I mean? So to take a little bit on that on board, because it allows you to move on. It allows you to say, okay, let's stop fighting each other, let's get to work on things. And the other thing that I think is very important in psychological terms is that if you want people to engage, certainly I've found getting people to engage in dark stuff, is one, give them something to do, give them choices, and give them other people to do it with. It's what I think we're doing. I think for me, it helps that I'm doing stuff because it gives one a sense of purpose around it all. And then as plug the book, Brian Davey, who's one of the people in the book that we've just produced, says, in the end, collapse doesn't exist. What exists is today, now, what's around you, who you're talking to, how you feel. That's all that really exists. So, not to let the anxiety or the disorientation ever take that away. And one of the things I've found is that contrary, and I've been talking to people here and all that, and people I know elsewhere, is that I found the doomy people to be some of the most level-headed, smiley, humorous, whatever, which kind of says something. And I'll kind of leave it at that, and you can ask me questions. Sorry about not having the full presentation, but thank you.